We are going to mute everybody, or forgive me for muting everybody. But if you need to say something desperately, please yell or unmute yourself or do something like that. We're another week and we're another episode. And as I mentioned 2 weeks ago, that in the middle of the book of Numbers, or towards the beginning of the book of Numbers, we suddenly have a change from being on the ascendancy. A lot of good things were happening, counting the Jewish people. As we said, God counts us with love. And there was the lighting of the menorah. And there was the tribes together. Everything just seemed to be in such a good place, the inauguration of the sanctuary. And then suddenly 2 weeks ago, in the middle of the portion, it talks about the Jewish people complaining about the menu and they didn't like the food. And Moshe Rabbeinu was wholly disappointed. It wasn't just that they'd sinned and done the wrong thing. The headspace was in the wrong place. They were like losing the plot. And as of that episode and event, everything seems to go downhill. Last week we had the Spies. This week we have the rebellion of Korach. And we're actually going to have to see what is the connection between the two. And as the weeks unfold right now, it seems to be one terrible episode after the other, which means that it's wonderful to be on the ascendancy, but one has to concentrate. One has to recognize that one needs to aspire and live up to that journey upwards. But when one loses sight and one begins to be sidetracked by side issues, it's very easy to turn what was a journey upwards into a journey downwards. So let's just go through some of the details in a summary. We'll rush through it quickly. Korach is Moshe Rabbeinu's first cousin. He stages a rebellion against Moshe and Aaron, and he gathers 250 people together. They're actually prominent people, and he accuses Moshe Rabbeinu and Aaron of power hoarding. That the whole issue is that I've got to fight for the rights. I am a freedom fighter, and I fight for human rights, and why should Moses and Aaron be more important than anybody else? They specifically took issue with the fact that Aaron was appointed as the Kohen Gadol. And there was a whole calculation, which the commentaries speak about, that there were different brothers, and Aaron, Moshe Rabbeinu was of the one family, so it should have skipped over to the cousins, and the next in line should have been Korach. So often when a politician tells you, I'm here because I want to lift up the masses, I have like this desire to make a difference in society, I want to make sure everybody is living a better life. So we know that politicians, read my lips, they often say that they're here to take care of everybody else's needs. And as soon as they're elected, they ride into the sunset because they really were taking care of somebody's needs much closer to home. And that is clearly what's going to unfold in this whole episode with Korach. He speaks the speech, talks about wanting to take care of everybody's needs, but in actual fact, he's only focused on one person's needs, and that is his own. So Moshe Rabbeinu unsuccessfully attempts to dissuade the rebels from participating in the suicide. People said before, how do we change the momentum against Israel? It's very hard to dissuade when there's a mass hysteria. It's very hard to turn around. I skipped out number 4. Moshe Rabbeinu said that they should bring incense, and when they bring incense, Hashem would reveal that the choice of Aaron was in fact by God's decision. Moshe Rabbeinu pleads to God not to accept the incense offering of the rebellious group. Korach incites the Jews against Moshe. He gathers them to witness the grand spectacle. He is convinced that he is going to bring about change for society or for himself. Hashem is angered and he wants to destroy them. Moshe and Aaron pray for the Jews and they say, please don't destroy your people Israel, and the decree is averted. It's not repetition. It's happened a number of times that Moshe and Aaron have to intercede. Moses davens for his people again and again when they fail, including this time. Then what happens is, if anyone needed a sign, the sign came. It was very demonstrative. It was absolute proof where God was putting his choices. The earth opens up suddenly in the middle of the desert, and Korach and his family are swallowed up by the earth. Simultaneously, a fire breaks out, and the fire destroys the 250,000, where's this, how do I get off the screen? The 250 rebels that came with Korach. So Korach is swallowed up, that's one punishment in his family. the 250 people who attach themselves to Korach are just burnt in a fire that breaks out. So pretty much God had made clear what his intention was. Okay, Aaron's son Elazar retrieves these incense pans because they'd all brought incense with fire, and then the fire breaks out, and suddenly all those who are holding their incense pans are destroyed in the fire, and Aaron is still standing, so it's pretty clear who God was intending to be the representative, the priest, the high priest. So Aaron is told by Hashem to utilize the pans and beat them such that they will plate the Mizbeach, that's the altar of the sanctuary, so that there would be a visible deterrent. So that anybody who now wants to challenge Moshe and Aaron, they will know. Remember these 5 pans? Remember? They plated the altar so that there would be a clear sign to everybody exactly what was God's decision. Now guess what happens? This is like some things just, it's so obvious, they just repeat themselves in history. Who becomes now the source of everybody's upset? The community blame Moshe and Aaron. They say, you caused the death of all these people. The 250 people and Korach, the rebel, they died, but they only died because of you, Moshe Rabbeinu. So they're actually angry at Moshe and Aaron. You know the famous statement of "you hit me back first," which is constantly used against Israel. You hit me back first means let's disregard the fact that I've launched a few rockets at you, or lots of them, but what did you do in response? Moshe and Aaron had responded to the rebellion, and now they're the cause. Hashem informs Moshe and Aaron that he intends to destroy them in an instant. Now this is the third punishment. We had the ground opening up, we had fire. The third punishment was a plague that strikes the nation, and many thousand dies. Moshe tells Aaron to use a pan of incense to hold the plague. So interestingly, the incense brought about the plague, or brought about the fire, the destruction, and now the same pan of incense is going to be used to resolve the problem. Now what happens is a real choice, a demonstrative choice of God is going to miraculously unfold, and that is they took a staff, meaning a stick, which would represent each tribe. They wrote the names of the tribe prince on the stick for each of the tribes. So each tribe had a stick, and the stick had the name of the prince of that tribe on it. And there was going to be one for the tribe of Levi as well, which had the name of Aaron. So the heads of each of the tribes' names were engraved into the stick, and they were brought into the sanctuary. They were placed overnight in the holies of holies, the holiest space. And when they came in the morning, miraculously, Aaron's staff, which was a simple stick, detached stick, had blossomed with almonds. Almonds, we are told in numerous places in the Torah, are the fastest to blossom when it comes to the season of the new fruits blossoming. So almonds are often a sign of things that are very important and urgent. They came in the form of almonds, but this dry, detached stick suddenly blossoms with almonds to say, further proof that what you think is not part of God's plan is very much alive. What you thought was a stick cut off is in fact alive, and only Aaron's blossomed. So they had now further proof that Aaron in fact was exactly who God wanted to lead, to be the high priest. That staff of Aaron was placed in the holies of holies. It was to remain in perpetuity so that it would remind everyone. There were only a few things left in the holies of holies to remind us. One of them was the staff of Aaron. There was another container that held the man, so that a container of man was also kept to remind the Jewish people how God sustained us in the desert. And for many hundreds and hundreds of years until we lost the parts of the temple, or they were hidden away, and please God, we'll be reunited with them one day when the world is once again redeemed. Now Hashem commands the Kohanim and the Levim to prevent unauthorized entry by non-Kohanim. So now it became very important to take precautions to make sure that people didn't overstep their bounds. So there was a need to tell the Jewish people, don't step closer than is safe for you. If it's too sanctified and you are not up to the level of being there, stay back. Stop, that's like the end of that event. But obviously it's connected to what happens before. We're now given the instructions as to what the Jewish people have to give as gifts to the Kohanim. And there were numerous gifts. It related to the 5 shekels of redemption, related to the portions of grain and oil and wine and crops and first fruit, etc. So we have the gifts that are given to the Jewish people. And the promise of what we need to give to the Kohanim shows the importance of the Kohanim in the midst of the Jewish people, what the Levim have to give, and how even the Levim who receive from the Jewish people, they themselves must give a tenth of their tenth to the Kohen. So we have the establishment of Aaron as being the authentic high priest, and then we have the importance of the priesthood as an institution, as the people who represented the Jewish people. They didn't get property when the other tribes did, and they were supported by the Jewish people, and that is how the portion ends. Let's go to some of the messages that we can take out of a portion that talks about these historical events, but obviously the objective when we learn the Torah is not just to learn a history lesson. That's the Torah means instruction. So it is important to derive from the storyline life messages that we can apply in our own present condition in life today. The first all-important word of the entire portion is Vayikach Korach. Korach is the name of the personality, which is the name of the portion, because it talks about this individual Korach who was the rebel who wanted to take over. But the first word is the verb, because in Hebrew, the verb comes before the subject. So it doesn't say Korach took, it says, and took Korach. That's how the grammatical form is. And the first word of the entire portion that talks about rebellion and challenge and a question of who's the right, authentic leader is very indicative and instructive. The word Vayikach means, and Korach took. He took himself, and he took 250 people with him, and he took a whole soul and heart of the Jewish people. And the word taking is very, very important, because a person can either be a giver or a taker. And we know that there are different types of individuals in this world. There are those people who contribute, to make a difference, to lift up other people, who impact on the lives of others by the way that they contribute. And then there are people that are constantly sapping the energy, taking away from what is developing and growing. They are detractors. And the very first word of this entire portion gives us an insight into what kind of person Korach was. Was he such a champion of the downtrodden? Was he such a champion of human rights? It was Vayikach Korach. He took it. He took himself. He was a taker. That is instructive and gives us an insight into the persona of Korach. What did he want in life? He wanted for himself. He was a taker. What's interesting is that in Ethics of Our Fathers, it contrasts. There are many contrasts, and the Torah is actually very powerful in contrasting events. Often the juxtapositioning of two different events next to one another is contrast, which shows how the one is actually so starkly different from the other. And sometimes we compare different personalities. So in Ethics of Our Fathers, it says that there are certain arguments that take place that are for the sake of heaven. For example, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. They argued a lot throughout the Talmud, but the argument wasn't one of undermining or taking away from somebody else. It was always trying to assess and to find out the truth. And therefore, the Ethics of Our Fathers, Pirkei Avot, tells us that that is a Shem Shamayim, was for the sake of heaven, and therefore, Sofer Kayem, it remains, meaning both sides remain. Hillel, who is normally the authority whom we dictates the bottom line law, we normally follow the reasoning of Hillel, but Shammai, who was his protagonist in all these arguments, is recorded in the Torah and recorded in the Talmud, and we value and we hold holy Shammai's opinion, because that is an argument that was for the sake of heaven. It wasn't an argument about personalities. It wasn't a Rabble, as we say in South Africa. It wasn't two individuals who were at each other. They were pursuing the truth, and they differed. I think I've told the story when I was a kid in yeshiva. I spent a number of Shabbatot, Shabbos in Bnei Brak, at the chief rabbi of Bnei Brak, who's the chief rabbi, was the teacher of my father, Rabbi Landau, the old Rabbi Landau. Since then, his son, Reb Moshe, took over as the chief rabbi, and he's also since passed away, and the grandson is now involved. So we're talking about generations. So when I was a kid, 16 years old, and I used to go to Bnei Brak for Shabbos, these sons of Rabbi Landau, Reb Moshe and Reb Elie, would argue at the table, and I thought Third World War had broken out. I thought somebody was going to get injured because the intensity and the volume and the veracity of the argument, it just accelerated to the point I was sure somebody was going to lunge a spoon or worse at the other. And then suddenly the mother brought in the fish or the soup, and everyone went about eating soup, and everything was calm, and that was it. The discussion was about the point in law, and they were very, very involved in the argument, but nobody was at each other as a real anger. This was all argument. That is how you walk into yeshiva, people are screaming and shouting and debating. That's all fine. That's a machloket, an argument that is for the sake of heaven, and it will remain. By contrast, it says, look at the argument of Korach. That was destroyed. It was eaten up by the earth. It was devoured. It was caused fire and plague. It was destructive. But what's interesting and very telling is that when Ethics of Our Father says, look at the difference between the argument of Hillel and Shammai, it presents the two sides of the argument. Hillel always argued with Shammai. But when it presents the contrast with Korach, it says, as opposed to Korach and his community. It should have said, as opposed to Korach and Moshe, the two sides of the argument. Why does it say, as opposed to Korach and his people? He wasn't arguing with his people, they were with him. And the commentaries point out, when you have an argument that is for taking, not for contributing, not in pursuit of truth, but for your own agenda, in the end, there is dissension not only between Korach and Moses. It becomes a dissension in the ranks between Korach and his own people. There's no real allegiance. It's like the parties in the Knesset gathering together and saying, yeah, we'll make this whole new conglomerate of different things and we're all going to stand together. And everybody knows that this is going to last until the first complication because there's no love lost between these different parties. Nobody really, and they're holding on to one another with very tender hooks. But the argument is not between them and the other side. The argument is going to be between them and themselves. Because when everyone has their own personal agenda, everyone is a threat to it. Not only the other side, not only the other party, the opposition, even the parties that are part of your own conglomerate are your threat because they get in your way. It's about ego, it's about me. So Korach was not only fighting with Moshe Rabbeinu, he was ultimately creating dissension, not only between him and those who followed Moses, but between him and his own followers. Because if it's about ego, nobody's going to win. Nobody's going to succeed. Everybody's going to undermine each other, which is the case of this personality, Korach. So he was joined with Datan and Aviran. We are told that they came from the tribe of Reuven. And the Midrash and the Talmud goes to great length to tell us that these two personalities, Datan and Aviram, are repeatedly involved in service. They all, wherever something's going wrong, wherever there's something going wrong, Datan and Aviram are somewhere behind that. For example, remember the story when Moses was young, as a young man. He was in Egypt. And he went out of the palace and he saw that there was an Egyptian who was hitting a Jew, and he slayed the Egyptian. He looked this way, he looked that way, he saw there was nobody, and he slayed the Egyptian, but there was somebody, Datan Aviram. These two guys, they watched Moshe and they went to tell the authorities. And they warned Moshe. We told the authorities, and Moshe had to escape for his life. And he goes to Midian, where he meets his wife and his father-in-law, and the whole story unfolds. But who were the two individuals that went to the authorities to tell about Moshe Rabbeinu's having killed the Egyptian? These two guys, Datan and Aviram. Then when they left Egypt, constantly antagonistic to Moshe and Aaron. When they came to the instruction that the manna was received, don't go out to collect it on Shabbos, because it's not going to land on Shabbos. Collect your double portion on Friday, which is the reason why we have 2 challahs at the Shabbos table, because it was collected a double portion before Shabbos, because they didn't collect on Shabbos. And then there's an episode, it doesn't say who they were, but the Talmud fills in the detail. The same Datan v'Aviran, they go out together and they put out some of the manna to undermine Moses. They put it out so that they could collect it on Shabbos. And now they joined Korach. So Rashi says that why did we learn that Datan and Abiram were from the tribe of Reuven? So if we look at the map of how the Jewish people encamped, this is the entire encampment of the Jewish people. There were 3 tribes, to the east, to the north, to the south, and to the west and to the south. And there were 3 tribes on each of the 4 sides. That's 12 tribes. In the middle, you had the sanctuary right in the middle, and around the sanctuary in an inner circle, this inner bagel, square bagel, were the tribes of the Levim, including Kahat, from which Korach came. Now you can see Kahat and Ruvain are right, the 2 tribes are right next to each other. Datan and Abiram, these 2 infamous personalities, came from the tribe of Reuven. So the commentaries point out, Oy l'Rasha, Oy l'Shcheinai. Woe to the wicked, and woe to his neighbor. If you hang around with the wrong people, there's going to be negative influence. So these 2, Datan and Abiram, having been neighbors of Korach and his family, influenced him negatively. So we have to always be wary not to be on the receiving end of the influence of others, or as the Rebbe always wanted to, as we spoke about lamplighters last week, he wanted us to be a source of positive influence, not only not to be influenced negatively, but to be the agent of change positively for others. So Korach followed and was together with Datan v'Abiram, who had many, many cases before challenged Moshe Rabbeinu's authority and caused a lot of havoc. There's an interesting comment in the Talmud about the role of a wife. And again, there's the 2 contrasts. We learn a lot from contrast. One of the people who joined himself with Korach was On ben Peles, On, the son of Peles, and he actually survives. The commentaries want to know, how did he survive? We said all the 250 people were killed by fire, and the others were killed by plague. And the Talmud tells us, fills in the details, that he came home to his wife and he said, I've put my name down on Korach's guys. I've joined his list. His wife said to him, are you crazy? What are you getting involved with this argument? Moshe Rabbeinu, how are we going to survive this? You got to get out. He says, it's too late. I've put my name down. And she contrives the whole thing to hide her husband. And when they came looking for him, she was the one that got in the way. She is the example of a wife who managed to get her husband back onto the right path. And by contrast, Korach had his wife saying, egging him on, and saying, yeah, Korach, you deserve it. You deserve it more than Aaron. Why are you losing out? She egged him on. So there was the influence for positive and the influence for negative. As it says in the holy book of Mishlei, in Proverbs, Chachmas Nashim Ban Sobesa, it's the wisdom of woman, or a wise woman builds her house. There is so much impact that a woman can have on her home, on her family, on her husband. Should never underestimate the extent that there can be an influence that comes from the sensitivity, the insight, the depth of a woman, and the impact that she can have. So the Talmud goes into great detail that Korach presented various arguments. He didn't just say, I challenge Moses. He came and he asked what seemed to be very rational questions. But we are introduced by the commentaries to the difference between a query and a question. How would you say? What's the difference between a query or a question? A query is not looking to find an answer. A query is a challenge. If you go in and you say to the guy at the ticket office where you're buying a ticket for the car train, and you say, how much does it cost for a ticket? That's a question. If you walk in there and you say, why is the train late? That's not a question. Because if the guy answers you the reason that the train is late because of this and this and this, it's not going to make you feel any better. You're still going to be late for work. When you're asking that, it's not because you want an answer. You don't need an answer. You're querying why they aren't living up to their responsibility to be on time. What was Korach? He had supposedly very technical questions. We even know the nature of the questions. But in actual fact, it wasn't seeking insight, enlightenment, details, meaning, illumination. He was looking to challenge. It was a query. Now I want to go back to last week before go forward. Last week we said that we needed to understand the argument of the spies that went into Israel and came back with a negative report. Why did they come back with a negative report? We asked last week. They were representatives of the tribes. They were important people. They weren't simpletons. Why did they not think that God could transcend and trump all of the enemies, that all of the challenges that lay ahead of them as they were coming into the promised land, these mighty nations? If God could take care of Egypt, which was much mightier than them, why would God not be able to deliver them from the hands and deliver into their hands all of these formidable enemies that are part of the future, part of the land that they're entering into? And we explained that the tribal leaders, these spies, had a thought process. They weren't simple people. What was their essence of their argument? They said, we know that God can do miracles. And in the desert, we live a life of miracles. Everything is done miraculously. We are just simply the passengers being swept away by God's miracle. But as soon as we cross over and we leave the desert and we go into the promised land, then we're going to be vulnerable. Then we're going to be involved with the mundane. We're going to have to plant, and we're going to have to be involved as farmers. We're going to have to work the land. It's not going to just be a miraculous existence. We're going to be party to creating our own success, and therefore our involvement is going to be very, very tangible and integrated into the mundane and the physical and the earth. And we're scared. God can take care of anything, but once we are agents of change, then we cannot rely on the miracles of God, and that's when we're going to fail. And remember, the answer of Joshua and Caleb, the two spies of the positive response, said, no, it's not about the desert. The ultimate goal is not to live in a desert. The desert is a preparation stage. It is the stage of pregnancy. The embryo is in the womb, waiting to be born. But ultimately, the reason that the embryo is in the womb, warm and cuddled and fed and oxygenated and everything taken care of from the mother, ultimately the point is about being born and having a responsible life and walking and talking and reaching and doing things for a lifetime. And it's about going into the world and doing mitzvahs. It's not about the miracle. Now, if that was last week's premise, that there was a world of miracles, and then the two spies, Joshua and Caleb, clearly were able to drive home the point that it's not about the world of miracles. It's about the fulfillment of commandments in the physical mundane world. That became an opening for Korach. Now we understand why Korach follows as an episode immediately after the spies. Because if the world is about miracles, nobody could challenge Moses. Moses was the instrument of miracles. He was the miracle maker. Korach is going to stand up next to Moses. Was the one who went up the mountain, got the Torah. He held the stick out and split the sea. Moses was the means by which all these miracles happened. But the answer they got at the end of last week is that the goal is not the miracles. The goal is the human involvement. It's about people tangibly getting involved with mitzvahs. They saw then that the stocks, the value of Moshe Rabbeinu was diminished, because Moshe Rabbeinu's real strength is the conductor of miracles. But if it's now up to every individual to go into the world and be involved with the fulfillment of mitzvahs, that's when Korach comes up with the argument. Kol ha'am kulam kadoshim. We're all holy. We all have a role to play. It's about the mitzvah. So we can all be instruments of doing the mitzvah. It's not about being the miracle man. Moshe Rabbeinu, what you did was what was. And it was very important. But going forward, we actually don't need you. We don't need you separate from any one of us. We're all in this together. And the Talmud says that the actual technical question they asked was, if you have a talus, and talus has the garment, and then you have the strands, and one of those strands in times of old, some people even today, was blue. It was made from a very special dye that made one of the strands of the tzitzit blue. Korach came along and he said, what happens if you have the whole talus, the whole garment, and all the tzitzits are made out of this blue dye? Do you still need the one strand that's dyed blue? What happens if the whole talus is blue? Sounds like a very technical, removed question. Very symbolic, very, very involved. What were they saying? They were saying that we need to have a strand of blue when nobody has the capacity for miracles, and only one person has is Moshe Rabbeinu. But if you're saying the whole people are holy, that was what you told us, because we're all going to be involved in dealing with the mundane world and utilizing it to serve Hashem. It's now up to all of us as individuals to be involved. Why do we need that one strand that's dyed blue? The uniqueness of one individual. We're all good. We don't need a Moshe. It was very symbolic. We don't need the individual that previously was the reminder and the instrument of holiness. We're now all conductors of holiness. And similarly, they said we need a mezuzah when you walk into a house. But what happens if the house is full of holy books? So you don't just have one scroll with the words of Shema on it. You've got thousands of scrolls. The bookcases are filled with scrolls. Do you still need a mezuzah on the doorpost? Again, this sounds like a very technical question. It was very symbolic. They were saying, we understand you need a mezuzah when the only scroll you have is this mezuzah. So we need a Moshe Rabbeinu when nobody else can do what Moshe Rabbeinu can do. But once you've said that it's now about filling the shelves with books, it's about the Jewish people, every single one of us, being able to do mitzvahs. Let's look at the mitzvahs. Why do we need a special element of a mezuzah on a house that's filled with holy scrolls? The whole Jewish people are holy. We don't need Moshe Rabbeinu. And obviously that was wrong. Because even if we're all able to do the mitzvahs and to do wonderful things, and God is empowering every single one of his children, you and me, every man, woman, and child, we still need leadership. We still need attachment. We still need connection. We need somebody who's going to be the conscience, the reminder that it's not about ego, that it's not about ourselves. We need to be able to have the focus that Moshe Rabbeinu brings us, even in the world of entering into the promised land. Then it was Joshua, it wasn't Moses, but we still need the tzaddikim, the righteous people, who are going to ensure that we stay on the straight and the narrow. And what's so ironic is that the spies last week said, we don't want to go into the promised land. We don't want to get involved with the earth. We don't want to get involved with the technicalities of doing the mitzvahs ourselves. We want to be here in the desert where God, you do everything miraculously. And if we go into the land, what's going to happen? It's going to be an eretz oicheles yoshver. The words that the spies used were, the land is going to devour us. We're going to get involved with the earth, the mundane, and the mundane is going to overwhelm us. But the wording that they used was, we're going to be swallowed up by the earthliness, by the mundane, by the physicality, by the earth. It's going to swallow us up. What happens the next portion? When Korach challenges, revolts, and has a rebellion against Moshe Rabbeinu, what's the punishment of Korach? He's swallowed up by the earth. Exactly what the spies saw, what they feared. Because the only way we don't get swallowed up by the earth is when we are true to follow and to adhere to the leadership and the powerful instrument that ensures that we are connected to Hashem, the Moshe Rabbeinu. When we connected to Moshe Rabbeinu, then we can master the physicality. But if we reject Moshe Rabbeinu as Korach did, exactly what the spies feared will happen. And they said the land, the earth, the physicality will devour, the earth devours Korach. So we see how necessary it was to have the mezuzah on the doorpost and the special tzitzit. Even if the garment, even if the entire Jewish people seem to be so holy, we still need to have the role of a Moshe Rabbeinu. That's what we've spoken about, why it follows exactly after the spies, why it's a follow-on. And it's interesting is that the themes of light and day and darkness and night happen in so many places in the Torah. Whenever there is confusion, whenever there is doubt, it talks about the night. For example, when Jacob fights the angel of Esau, the entire night, the conflict which represents this inner battle of lack of clarity until eventually the dawn broke. So it wasn't just a question of time, what time of day. It was symbolic of saying that through the darkness, eventually the light pierces through. There's a sunrise, the dawn of a new day, and there's clarity. There's a new beginning. And that's when the angel turned to Jacob and said, let me go. The morning has come, I need to go. They often have the night and the day. And over here, when they put those sticks into the holies of holies to find out which stick would blossom, it says Boker. The morning came, like Boker Tov in Hebrew today. The morning arrived. And then it was clear which of the sticks had blossomed. And it was more than just the timing of the day that it happened at 6:30 in the morning. It's saying that the darkness that pervades when there's doubt, when there is the introduction of this hysteria and this undermining and negativity, everything goes dark. And then we, in this cloud of doubt, and how are we going to get out of this? How are we going to get out of the COVID? And how are we going to get out of anti-Semitism? How are we going to get out of it? We have to know that Boker, the morning will come, and ultimately clarity will prevail, and ultimately the truth will come out, as it did then in the whole story of Korach and Moshe Rabbeinu. The beautiful side story that the Talmud in Sanhedrin says is this same Datan and Aviram, these two people who I've told you were at Moshe Rabbeinu from the moment he started. Right in Egypt, they were the ones who went to tell the authorities that Moses had killed the Egyptian that was hitting the Jew. But now in the midst of the rebellion, it says, and Moshe went to Datan and Aviram. And the Gemara says it's significant that Moshe went to them. And it's instructive. You know, sometimes we stand on ceremony and we have an argument and we say that I am right. And we're so stubborn that we'll lose the battle as long as I don't have to give up on my ego. My father always used to tell the story about the guy who went to the dentist, and the dentist said, so which tooth is hurting you? He says, I'm not going to tell you which tooth is hurting me. You're the expert, you should know. So he pulls out a tooth. The guy says, no, it's a Rouser. That's not the right one. That's not the right tooth. He says, tell me which is the right tooth. He says, I'm not going to. So he stands on ceremony until eventually you've got surely teeth, and he's got he's living with his inability to simply just do the right thing. Don't stand on ceremony. So in machlokas, in arguments, so often, the reason why there's no resolution in the shalom bayis between husband and wife is because somebody is standing on ceremony and saying that you are the one that has to sort this out. I'm innocent, I'm right and you're wrong, and I'm not going to take the first step because it's up to you to fix it. And we live in misery, and we live in the pain of conflict and unresolved issues in families, between parents and children, between siblings, between husband and wife and friends, just because we don't have the capacity to. Moshe Rabbeinu goes to Datan and Aviram. He had every reason to say, I am Moshe, I'm the leader. Datan and Aviram are vagabonds. They are the ones that are causing all this terrorists. Who should go to who? I'll stand in my tent, let Datan and Aviram come here. Not that it helped, because even though Moshe Rabbeinu went over to them, they still didn't turn away. But the Gemara says, look at all these little details between the lines. Don't be stubborn. Don't be dafka when you're in an argument. Be the one who takes the first step forward, because ultimately you might be freeing yourself out of your self-imposed jail because you just don't know how to extricate yourself from where you are. I'm going to end off with the story of the gifts to the Kohen, but just want to emphasize again that this story of Korach is about the person who stands up in society and says, I am the liberator. I am the individual who's come to take care of all the needs of humankind. I care for human rights. I want to make sure that nobody's hurt. And in actual fact, he is the cause of the destruction of 250 people and then thousands of people in the plague. Look what happens. Look how the difference between a terrorist and a freedom fighter is just like how it becomes known. And it's very easy to paint a picture. And we keep trying to be relevant to the events in Israel today. It's uncanny that you have the perpetrators who began a war by sending rockets, trying to undermine the Iron Dome. There's no evidence that there was a whole plan to undermine it, so that they could cause the maximum, in fact, the maximum death to the civilians. And they are the ones that somehow are able to get a message out that I'm the freedom fighter. I'm here to stop apartheid in the Middle East. It's the irony, the absolute hypocrisy and the lie of what is really going on. Who is the perpetrator of evil? Who is the one that's saying, I do not want to live with you from the river to the sea? From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Add the two words of Jews. And that is the intention. They say it in their charter. And yet somehow they're able to paint a picture of we're the ones fighting for human rights. Be very careful. Don't jump. Make sure that Boker, the morning comes, and we know exactly what is the true story behind it. I'm going to end up with these gifts to the Kohen, which were quite a lot. The Rambam, Maimonides, we're about to conclude an entire cycle of learning the Rambam over the period of a year. It's very exciting. We do 3 chapters a day, and this coming week we're going to complete the entire 14 books of the Rambam. So he says, when it comes to giving gifts to Hashem, he says, make sure that you give of your best. If you make a donation to the shul, to the house of Hashem, then make it better than your own. Don't say that my house has to live up to a certain level, but the way that the shul should operate, it's good enough if it's a stable, if it's just a simple building. Make sure that if our standard of living is X, then what we contribute to our religion and to our people and to tzedakah should be double that, should be more than that. And it says when you feed the hungry, people often say, well, I appreciate caviar. I know good wines. But if I'm feeding the pauper that's coming in, he doesn't know the difference. For him, who cares if it's this kind of wine or that kind of wine, or this kind of food or that kind of food? He'll be happy if I give him crumbs. So the Rambam says, no. It tells something about where you are in life. Rather, you eat the crumbs and feed the hungry from the best of your foods at the table. When you clothe the poor, don't say, well, they don't know anything about designer clothing. For me, I know, so I've got to make sure that I spend well on myself. But when I clothe the poor, I can just give them simple stuff. The headspace should be, when I'm giving of my best. When I'm donating to the temple, the mikdash, the temple, of the best. And the general rule is kol chelev lahavaya. The best and the finest should be for Hashem. So the end of this portion, which talks about the rebellion of Korach and the rebellion against the priesthood, reinstates the priesthood, reinstates Aaron as he was intended to be it, and reminds the Jewish people, not only should you not detract from it, but when you're giving and supporting and being part of the program and wanting Aaron to be able to be the full Aaron that he is, then not only don't detract and rebel, obviously not, but when you support of your best, give of your strength, give of your time and your effort to make sure that Am Yisrael is stronger. May Hashem give us the ability and the strength to be the full beings we can, so that we can contribute meaningfully to our people Israel, to Am Yisrael. I really thank everybody for joining and for being part of the share today. And I'll put it onto YouTube as well, so that we'll be able to listen again or pass it on to somebody else. Thank you all for joining. Andrew, I didn't see you before. Joy, I didn't see you before. Sam, thank you for joining. Philip, thank you for coming. Who else is here? Neil, good to see you. Beulah, Mr. iPad, I wish I knew who you are. Peter, good to see you. All of you, thank you for joining, Joy. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you.
Have a wonderful week. God bless.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you. God bless.